At some point, we have to not just tear the statues down, but change the statutes. African-centered statutes. Ma'at. So we're going to take a quick break and come back to speak with our brother Miguel Lorne as we pay tribute this morning and remember our elder ancestor, Leonard P. Howell. Standing by to speak with our brother Miguel Lorne. All right, we go to the phone lines now to speak with Miguel Lorne. Miguel, how are you doing?
Greetings and blessings.
Yeah, man, give thanks. Thank you so much.
Greetings to the family.
And to you too, Miguel. Thank you so much for joining this morning as we talk about and remember Leonard Howell. I want to situate this morning, Miguel, for those who don't know, because there's so many who still don't know who Leonard Howell is, but I want to situate our conversation within the context of systemic classism, racism, colorism in Jamaica and the destruction of the first self-sufficient community in Jamaica, Pinnacle. For our younger listeners or newer listeners to the forum, Leonard Howell, if you were to contextualize him in one sentence before we go on, who was Leonard Howell?
Conceptualize him in one sentence.
Yeah, contextualize.
I would say black supremacy.
Black supremacy. All right.
Black supremacy.
Okay, 2 words.
That would sort of encompasses his many objectives, his attributes, his pursuits, and his militant stance when persecuted, when brought before the courts, and when imprisoned.
Yes.
That governed his mind right throughout black supremacy.
So let us talk about the early Leonard Howell. This man who came to be known, as Helene Lee calls him in her book, the first Rasta, and in the book, a book in which you are also mentioned a few times. What defined him? What was it? What was the political and social conditions out of which Leonard Howell rose?
Well, born in Crooked River, and as you mentioned, today, the 16th of June, that's the day of his birth, in 1898, Crooked River, Redlands, Crooked River in Clarendon.
Yes.
That's where he was born, and he grew up in that situation where he would see his father doing everything to accumulate some amount of land. The land was so important, and I think that influenced his mind a lot. That he realized that as black people, in order to go forward, he would have to own land. Not digressing, but I don't want to forget, the 16th of June is also Soweto Day.
Oh, 16th of June, yes. And that's, we're talking about Tuesday, yes.
When our children stood up in South Africa against tanks and bullets and machine guns to defend our rights. So it's nice that it's coinciding with, as we speak of, another great event with Leonard Howell.
Yes.
So born in that situation, and Leonard Howell now, gradually as he grew up, he would see the general injustice that takes place in Jamaica when people don't have much rights, much land, and so on. Then he was actually sent to the United States at a fairly young age. There might be some discrepancy about the age, but it was somewhere about when he was 14. He had witnessed a murder. And in witnessing that murder, now the state wanted him to be a witness, and he didn't want to be a witness. And his father thought that the best thing to do was to send him out of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So he went abroad. Later on, he did lots of travels,
yes,
different places and so on. And when he came back to Jamaica, he was actually deported from the United States and came back to Jamaica in 1932.
Mm-hmm.
But he came back with a clear vision, having gone out there, experienced outside world, worked,
mm-hmm.
having intermingled with some of our great minds during that period of the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s.
Mm-hmm. Who were some of those that you would have intermingled with?
Oh, you have certainly intermingled with people like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Baldwin, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, and that whole UNIA, Garvey's persons who have that vision. You would have also experienced Du Bois and others.
Yes.
That Harlem Renaissance, which would have been the American way, but they themselves were influenced by the Negroid views that was experienced and spoke about from the French side. So he came back and he had the strong vision now of establishing a black foundations and so forth. And he, in coming back now, there were other brothers and sisters here who were espousing the doctrine of the black God. People like Reverend Fitz Valentine, Ashley Rogers and others. They had written extensively and were preaching. We had local preachers here too, and they were highlighting the black God, that our God is, you either say the black God or you allude to the God of Ethiopia or the God of Africa. There were quite a number of writers and preachers who espoused that. What makes Leonard Howell different now was he climaxed all that thinking into Haile Selassie as the Almighty God. And that was very, very powerful at the time. And he would use terms like the living God, which saying that now would have been an affront to the Christian doctrine, because, they had acknowledged that their God was dead. So for someone to come and not only assert that Haile Selassie was now the Almighty God, but that he was the living God. And so he came under numerous persecutions and so forth, because he was there to be espousing that and challenging the entire white structure. He wrote it in his book, The Promised Key. Don't follow the preachers who preach white supremacy. Follow the preachers that preach that is Imperial Majesty Rastafari and preach the black doctrine. So he was very, very, very pointed.
And you talk about, and this is a time when people, and you talk about coming out of the Harlem Renaissance and a movement where people were redefining themselves and looking towards and inwards in terms of their Africanness and their African-centeredness. But Miguel, talk to us about how, so he identified Haile Selassie, the emperor. And before him, there were others who were doing that, but you're saying not necessarily to the extent that Howell himself placed the emperor at the center now, identifying him as the living God.
Yes.
So you'd say he was the first one to publicly acknowledge.
He was the first announcer of the faith.
Of the faith. And what methods, he obviously was talking about this, but talk to us about some of the other marketing tools that he used, which call it marketing tools in these days, to get the message out.
He he believes in setting up communities, not just, whereas many others would go on the road and preach, and some of them would set up churches. But he tried to acquire land and acquire land space so that it could be more than just a church where you would go and just preach, or you have a congregation and so on. He wanted a commune. He thought everything he had, he devoted to a community, a commune. And in this regard, although he wasn't here for a lot of bedward activities, but I think with the type of people that he would come across, because some of them were actually lieutenants in the Bedward setup. So, Bedward had that emphasis about land up in Augustown, up over on the banks of the river there and so on.
And what about his time in St. Thomas?
Pardon?
And what about his time in St. Thomas?
How was time in St. Thomas?
Yes.
Yes, yes, when he was up there at Trinityville.
Yes.
And he set up a community there, and he encountered problems with the authorities and some of the citizens who were influenced by the authorities there. So in search again, he moved from St. Thomas. He moved from Trinityville, came up, and that was how now he had organized. Before going up to set up Pinnacle, he had sort of set up different little pockets here and there in Kingston. He acquired land in Kingston, in the town, and different places. He would raise the flag. Anywhere you go, he would raise the red, gold, and green flag. And he set up the Ethiopian Salvation. And through that now, they acquired the land up at Pinnacle, a little outside of Spanish Town. And there he set up that community there. It wasn't just the land, it was a community where brothers and sisters now could go up and feel at home, and see that they don't, because anywhere else you live, you got to pay rent. You were suppressed. You were constantly depressed. But here you could now go to a community where we could all live and we could all share whatever we produce.
Miguel, I want to ask you to hold it right there. Just a very quick break, and we take it right from there when we return.
Yes.
All right, we're back with you inside of the Africa Forum. It is Running African, and my brother and colleague Miguel Lorne is on the phone lines. We're paying tribute and remembering this morning Leonard Howell. It's important for us to do this, and we're doing that within the context of ongoing and systemic racism, classism, colorism, you call it what you want, here in Jamaica, and the destruction of Pinnacle, the first self-sufficient community in Jamaica. Miguel, thanks for staying. I know, just listening to you talk, there's a theme through everything you have said so far. Every time Leonard Howell moved, you said he acquired land. He acquired land. So land...
and then the system tried to take it away from him.
Yes. And so that he recognized early that land meant liberation, meant freedom, meant the boots of the oppressor from off your neck. How important was it for somebody like Leonard Howell and his ideology for him to acquire land, to own land? Well, how important was this to him?
Absolutely important. And like I said, he was not thinking of his personal aggrandizement. He was thinking of the brothers and sisters around him, the community. But I should also point out that the build-up towards even Pinnacle, but he came back in 1932, and by January 1934, he was arrested. Out there in St. Thomas. He was arrested and charged for making seditious remarks. Now, sedition is either by speech or action that you are challenging the government. You are inciting a rebellion against the government. And when you look at the words that was alleged to have been used, it's crucial to realize, for our people to realize that these were trumped up. When you look at it now, Sister Cabo, it's embarrassing. Our government could have even put things that way, and that in the compensation package for Rastafari, this ought to be one of the areas that Rastafarians ought to be compensated.
Yes.
I'll just utter a little of it here for you.
Yes.
It is alleged that he uttered on the 10th of December 1933, in the presence of His Majesty's subjects and so, a seditious speech in which he abused the sovereign King George, Queen Victoria, the governor of Jamaica, and both governments of Great Britain and Jamaica, thereby intending to excite hatred and contempt for His Majesty King George and those responsible for the government of this island, and to create disaffection among the subjects of His Majesty in this island, and to disturb the public peace and tranquility of this island. That was the charge, which amounted to sedition.
Yes.
He gave a speech which disturbed and was inciting people to have disaffection against the king at the time, who was King George, and the government of Jamaica and the government of England.
And you know, and as you're speaking, Miguel, it dawned on me that in Parliament a few years ago we heard where, for years we've been saying, and you and many of us in the Pan-African spaces, that the names of some of our liberators must be cleared in terms of the charges through the tyrannical court.
They ought to be exonerated.
Right. And Leonard Howell, it seems, falls in that category, and we must also look at Bedward and others. So this is something that we should do. But
we must work on.
Of course.
For that offence that they have said there, he was given 2 years imprisonment.
Yes. And this, of course,
in March of 1934, he was convicted and given 2 years imprisonment.
Wow.
And in preparing to come on the air, I thought, and it took me a little time to find it. Because I remembered, not digressing, but it's so important. I remember there was a case in 1966, a brother named George Myers, Rastafarian brother.
Yes.
And he was charged, you see, there were the areas that they use. When it's not sedition, it's lunacy. That was the area that they use a lot. Or they would charge you under the Public Order Act. Now, this brother in 1966 was charged, and listen to what they are charging for now, that he and others had held a joint meeting in Western Kingston for the purpose of protesting against the visit of the Queen to Jamaica. During the course of his speech, George Myers referred to the Queen as that white parasite,
Wow.
and used such words as God damned the Queen. It was felt that these words were inciting the crowd and all of that, and therefore in breach of the peace. And he was charged under the Public Order Act of 1957. Now he was convicted and initially locked up, but eventually was reduced to a fine. So I'm saying that here was over in 1933, almost the same thing, that he was condemning the whole thing about King George and all of them, and we should not be loyal to them. And here is George Myers in 1966 being charged for almost similar, because he was saying, God damn the Queen, and she's a white parasite.
And
he too was charged.
And so many of them were also charged, some imprisoned, and some sent to the madhouse, some sent to Bellevue.
Yes, it was common. When the evidence was so scandalous that they couldn't even convict you on it, they sent you to Bellevue. In other words, you don't go home. For you to be saying Haile Selassie and Black God and all of that, you must be mad.
Yes.
So that was how we were treated constantly. And hear this now, to show you the level of the internationality of all of this, which Howell would not have known, and many of us only knew it later on. The judge who came to Jamaica, the Chief Justice at the time, Robert William Lyle Grant, he was the Chief Justice. Now, normally, Sister Kabu, the court, the number one court downtown, from them time till now, is always called the biggest court. It's always called the Chief Justice Court. If you ever go down there, see it doesn't call it. That said number one. It's just said the Chief Justice Court because the Chief Justice usually sits in that court. He can sit in any court he wants, you know. But that is like his domain.
Right.
Now I say that to point out. Now here was the Chief Justice leaving his domain to go to St. Thomas, Morat Bay, specifically to try Leonard Howell. And we later discovered that this particular Chief Justice came from Scotland. He was one of those. He was at one time stationed in Nyasa Land. Nyasa Land is Malawi now. And he was one of those who tried the followers of John Chilembwe. John Chilembwe had raised an uprising in Malawi at the time because they were rebelling against the Scottish, the English, and the Irish who had come to Malawi and was forcing the white God concept upon the people. And Chilembwe, John Chilembwe, rebelled against it. He was killed. Many of his followers were captured and they were tried. The main judge who tried them was Robert William Lyle Grant.
Oh, okay.
So let's put it in context.
Yes.
Here were the brothers fighting to get rid of white supremacy in Nyasa Land. The judge who tried them found them guilty. Some were hanged, some were sent for long imprisonment. Then ended up in Jamaica now to try Leonard Howell, who is preaching black supremacy.
Exactly. And this is why even when we are talking about full liberation and how we go, where we go from here, I mean, with all the protests that we see across the world, that one element that we cannot leave out is judicial tyranny. There is no way that we can leave that out or leave out the role, the historical role of the courts. But even now, we have that very same situation. So we can tear down statues all over the world, and it makes sense. And this is why I'm saying tear down the statues and the statutes.
I notice you put emphasis on that.
Yes.
And being of a legal mind, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yes.
Because that is the silent hand that crushes the blow.
Yes.
It is those pronouncements that the police carry out and suppress people's actions all over the world. And this is why I want to emphasize that connection now, that here was the colonial arm trying Leonard Howell. He could never have gotten a fair trial before that man.
At no time at all. So in revisiting Leonard Howell, we have to revisit these trumped-up charges against him and his followers and Rastafari during that period, and to also exonerate them, because they are still on the books as what they are. But let's
exonerate and compensate.
And compensate.
You must compensate.
And compensate.
For these type of atrocities
and Miguel, talk about compensation now as we talk about Howell. Let us go to Pinnacle where you carried us earlier. We're going to stay on with you a little bit longer than we thought because we're not rushing this thing and we have to talk about it properly. So Leonard Howell is now in Pinnacle. Here's a man who came back from traveling the world, then finally deported to Jamaica, would have met with some of the great thinkers and movers in African-centered, Pan-African, Garveyite thinking. And then he would have come back to Jamaica and is now talking about seeing our God as black, seeing God as ourselves, and identifying His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor Haile Selassie, as God, the living God. At the same time, understanding that he needs to be self-sufficient, so he's acquiring land. He finally acquires land in Pinnacle. How much land we're talking about?
Pardon?
How much land we're talking about?
Oh, we're talking well over, certainly it was well over 500 acres of land.
You're talking,
at least, in Pinnacle.
That's a whole lot of land, Miguel.
A whole lot of land. And then now, when he moved up there, it was a whole lot of followers.
He bought this land.
He bought this land through the Ethiopian Salvation, this other little committee that he had set up, you know. And so they bought this land, they paid for this land, and over 2,000 brothers and sisters initially went up there with him. 2,000,
that's a lot, you know, Miguel.
That's a lot.
Yes.
And also, I am fortified that, and you see, again, we get it from even different sources. the police constantly raided, and they were watching up there, because it's bad enough when, you know, you're trying to suppress people now, but you can't get no. You're not at any meetings where you can talk about policeman come and write down what him say and all the madness there. Because I've never seen that, you know, the police turn up and write down things. But you find now that, and eventually we get this now from the police themselves, when they raided in 1954, that in one lady's house they found over 800 pounds. 800 pound money. In another, over 600 pounds. And continue down the line. Now, in 1954, 800 pounds could buy a lot of land in Mr. Cabo.
Yes.
So they were shocked.
Right.
But they were shocked now to see that this community was virtually self-sufficient. Mark you, when they took over 600 of them, were arrested and taken to court. They tried to say that most of this money was acquired from the sale of ganja. Whether it was so or not is unimportant to me.
Exactly.
But they themselves admitted that the land was heavily planted up.
So the model, the Pinnacle model, would be similar to the model that would have seen out of Tulsa, when we're talking about the Black Wall Street in Tulsa.
That would have been the ideal. That was a more modern, urban model.
Right.
It would have been a more rural model.
Yes.
Because they made limestone, they burned charcoal, they plant up the land, they had cow, goat, sheep, all sort of things. This is a powerful, self-sufficient community. It staggered the police mind.
And it would have been the first and the only one of its kind in Jamaica, wouldn't it?
Yes, Beer's Bedward had something going, but it was more temporary. People would go up to hear him, and then he would accommodate them, and they'd spend 3 or 4 days, some would spend a week. This was where people live now. In other words, this labor force was no longer available to the Kingston exploiters and the Spanish Town exploiters. This labor force was now independent. And that's the power of what Leonard Howell was doing. He was giving us a tremendous amount of independence when he set up Pinnacle.
And so the point of Leonard Howell, you know, is even while we talk about Leonard Howell as a first Rastafari, we still have to look at him, the complexities, because here is a man who wasn't just talking about the spiritual side of things, but looking also at how can you be now within the context of Mwalimu Marcus Mosiah Garvey and so many others to be self-sufficient, to literally not to be integrated, but to be self-sufficient. And I want you to analyze that for me, Miguel, because the thinking...
It's important, because when you see, because he had this black supremacy idea, because everything now, he felt that we must economically be independent and not be part of them. Leonard Howell at that time was talking about our own monument. This is 1930s and 40s and so, you know. Our own money mean our own bank.
Yes.
Those are the type of things Leonard Howell was preaching in those times, you know. That we must set up our own monument. And therefore would have our own bank. But the authorities now realize that not only was he setting up an independent structure, but when you start talking about your own banking system, your own bank and all of that, then that goes now, because you're not only challenging their economic structure, but you're now taking from their economic structure and making yourself awfully powerful.
And appealing to the masses of the Jamaican people, because if initially you have over 2,000 people going on this 500 acres, can you imagine that others were looking to move on probably that kind of movement towards Pinnacle?
Oh, yes, because by the time they raided, by 54 and all that time, the community had grown to more than 3,000.
Look at that.
So it was obvious that people were now joining and so on and so forth. And they would not, they realized that something had to be done now. Legally their hands should have been tied, but no, they find all sorts of excuses to And, one of the things I want to emphasize that the power of Leonard Howell in all of his court cases, whether in Morant Day, whether in Spanish Town, and so on, he never wavered. He never flinched. He never bowed. Right through, when they asked him, he said, yes, I did say that Haile Selassie is the returned Messiah, he's the Redeemer, he's the Almighty One. He was consistent, whether it was at Sutton Street Court, any court at all, he went. He utilized.
And so he was. Yes, go ahead, Miguel.
A lot of this is reported in the newspapers.
All right. And so he was dragged before the courts on numerous occasions.
Yes, and that's one thing was sent to Bellevue. Yeah, you must be mad. You can't be standing up here telling us that Haile Selassie. So you must be mad. And he bore all of that because right throughout he kept telling them, I was born a hero and I shall die a hero. So he was not flinching either. He was retaliating. In no ordinary terms and so on.
And that tells us a lot about his personality. What about the community of Pinnacle then? Who were these people who were now living on Pinnacle? These are Jamaicans who would have moved there, who would have listened to the teachings of Leonard Howell, somehow bought into the teachings of Leonard Howell, and would have gone there. What kind of situation existed at Pinnacle in terms of how people interacted?
There was independent thinking because, persons are living there. Leonard Howell would also marry them, He was they call him the counselor. Well, I get a lot of this from when I spoke to people like Miss Gertrude and, Brother Elder Reed and so on. They exuded a power, Sister Kabu, that was amazing. That was amazing. I watched in about 1980, Leonard Howell passed in about 81.
Yes.
Somewhere about 1982, 83, I watched Elder Reed, who was one of Brother Howell's lieutenants, and I watched him in court at Spanish Town. And this was when the court papers were brought against them to remove from Pinnacle. And he stood and he said, Judge, Mr. Howell's land is from shore to shore. The judge said, what you mean? He said, Mr. Howell's land is from sea to sea. Mr. Howell is extensive. And he spoke in that powerful manner to the judge. I remember Miss Parker in Spanish Town. That she even said to him, what you're saying, that I am sitting on Mr. Howell's land? And he said, oh, sure, Your Honor. You're on Mr. Howell's land.
Yes.
They had that power about them when they came to court or when they came to any activities.
Yes.
And in speaking to Miss Gertrude, you get that confidence that also. And they got that from Leonard Howell, that they felt sure. They were not humble, beggy. But they had that, they exude that majestic
confidence
about them.
Yes. Confidence of self, understanding who they were.
Yes. Where their children would have been schooled by them. Those children would not have gone through white thinking that had to be corrected, that some of us had to go through.
The colonized education, they would have stepped away from that and have their own schools, their own place of worship, their own bakery.
Their own hospital. They had their own healing facilities and all of that. So this was something that would have troubled the authorities extensively.
And just to underscore, this happened in Jamaica, this happened in Pinnacle. No, why was Pinnacle destroyed at the end of the day? Talk us through that. What happened?
Well, like I said, no, if this model had continued, it had taken off. Because when you take up 600 people to carry to court, and they were dealt with, 600 people dealt with in a day, some of them might have gone over to just 2 days. You deal with 600 cases. I mean, so that was kangaroo justice. So that model had continued, Sister Kabu, just picture where we would be today.
That is it.
The Rastafarian community would have been so self-sufficient in everything, because up there, remember, Howell's father was a tailor. And therefore, every picture of Howell, you see him majestically dressed.
Dapper.
Yes.
Yes.
So, and they had that attitude up there at Pinnacle. They sew their own clothes, they make their own clothes, and they were constantly looking imperial.
Yeah. You know, and that's the word, constantly looking imperial. Yes, go ahead.
They destroyed his library. He had an extensive library. Mm-hmm. He had an extensive collection of legal books from which he had brought, and so, as time went on, and so on. And the police raid, they burnt his library.
You know, it's a part of the history of Jamaica that is not even taught in schools. And this is it, because of the colonized education. You know, I went straight to high school studying history all the way to A level. I never met Leonard Howell in any of the studies.
So did I.
All right. You see how, when we talk about decolonizing education in Jamaica, these are some of the things, because what if we had this information? What if we knew? And what if Pinnacle had survived? So this was one of the first ways, and in many, many ways, but in the modern era, that they actually put their boots on the necks of those of us who tried, Jamaicans who tried to be independent, who stepped outside of the oppression to create their own spaces of independence. This is how it was dealt with. So Pinnacle eventually raided many times, Miguel, before it was destroyed.
Yes, brought down. And although the members continued, many stayed up there, many continued to put up like a thatched little roofs here and there, but it came to an end virtually when the developers moved in with the assistance of the government, with the assistance of the court, to get off many of our brothers and sisters, who then moved to Tredegar Park, who then moved, many from Pinnacle, then moved to Bacawal, Shantytown, and other places around Kingston and so forth.
They were dispersed.
Definitely.
So we have to talk about the Pinnacle diaspora.
They lost a lot of things that they had built up whilst they were at Pinnacle. They lost their space, they lost their dignity, and so on. And
there are many, and when you talk about internal reparation, this is one of the things that we have to look at seriously, because Coral Gardens aside, that's a whole other story. Yes. Pinnacle by itself is
a tremendous story.
All right.
And Leonard Howell, who is the center of the Pinnacle restoration, because Leonard Howell also had land out at Rockfort, Outlook Avenue. Mm-hmm. Leonard Howell had owned land, where Central Police Station is today, on East Queen Street. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He had owned land right in front there.
Right, because I know...
Where he would practice his medicine, where people would go, and because he was a serious healer, medical man. And all these lands is something that he bought, and it will be a community. Many times when they raided, they didn't find Howell there personally, because he set up things in such a way that he didn't have to be there every day.
And Miguel, his lands were stolen from him, and this is the thing that I want to get to with you now, because Leonard Howell, the over 500 acres of land in Pinnacle, and we're talking about the others, we're not quite sure what happened there, if he sold and so on, but in terms of Pinnacle, that land, Pinnacle, 500 acres, was stolen from Leonard Howell. How did this happen?
From black people. How it happened was that the developers who developed up there now and set up a company named St. Jago Heights and all of that, they claimed a prescriptive title. They claimed that they had been occupying the land for a certain amount of time, unmolested, which could never be true. Because I was in court when Edgar Reed and them were challenged, and Edgar Reed pointed out that he was on Pinnacle when he was a little boy. Mm-hmm. He never left. It was only when he was ordered by the court, and when he was ordered, he never leave. It was only when police came that people like Edgar Reed left.
So
all of this will have to be revisited at some point.
But at some point, immediately.
Yes, immediately. This is the 1980s now, because he's saying that I was there, and brothers and sisters were there. Yeah, Rastafarians know who were living at Pinnacle. We have brothers and sisters now around who were living at Pinnacle. So how could you claim to say that the developers occupy this land unmolested? Could never be true. But that is how a lot of these people get land. A lot of these people.
But this is an
all this hooray about Oliver Clark and all of that. But nobody mentioned how the Clark family got their land up there in Ridersville.
This is why earlier this morning I said, that we're watching the protests all over the world. But I am sure that here in Jamaica, we have not yet reached the threshold of the limit of our patience with oppression. We have not got there.
Because I made sure I listened to you this morning before I came on.
Yes.
And therefore you set the tone very, very well.
Miguel, we don't reach there, because if we were there, Pinnacle would be in our hands today.
We wouldn't have so much youths downtown that I have to encounter every day. We wouldn't have so much of them just walking up and down aimlessly with no future, with nothing ahead of them.
Okay.
Because again, even when brothers and sisters went to Bacawal and set up a community at Bacawal, later on in the 1960s, Siaga and Joe Williams and them moved down Bacawal, moved down Shantytown. So many of our brothers and sisters had to move again, and many of them ended up out at Riverton City. Some of them ended up at Spanish Town. But the history can easily be traced.
It can easily be traced.
What we're seeing now, with our youths and all of that, was set from those times, from 1930s, 40s, 50s, by the actions of the colonial government, aided and abetted by Bustamante Manley and those lackeys that they had here.
Miguel, hold the line. I'm coming right back there.
Yes.
Miguel, thank you for staying. Thank you for staying. I really want to have this conversation, because it seems to me as if the fight has gone out of us. The fight for Pinnacle in particular has gone out of us. I understand. I watched, 2007, Miguel. I think you gave the Leonard Howell lecture right here in the studio when we went in search of Leonard Howell, and what came out of that in terms of people looking again at Pinnacle and demanding the return of the lands to the people. And we saw all that happened with that. All that came out of that, and then we find ourselves same place which part would it start them days there. So the point of the matter now is, while we talk about racism in other countries, while our eyes are glued to the television screen watching Atlanta burn and London statues being toppled over in the UK, and people marching like crazy all over the world for equity and justice and equal rights and so on. Here in Jamaica, there are some issues that we have to focus on. One has to do with land ownership.
Yes. Absolutely, sister.
And this takes us now to the critical matter.
It's a deliberate thing for us, because we are less empowered. Not digressing, but just to mention, do you know that, for example, the people of McIntyre land, Dunkirk, many of the people in Tivoli, many of the people in many other places in Jamaica, you know that many of these people have paid off for their houses that they got the land in the 1970s. They got their little units. They have finished paying off for it. But most of them do have no title.
How so?
Them just not give them a title. The government has not given them any title, despite many of them don't pay it off 20 odd years ago. I've had instances where the persons had to go to the to the Ministry of Housing and get a paper now, a little piece of paper to say, yes, Miss Mary Lou is the owner of Block Unit 5, Block 33, and such and such. And in some instances they might say, we're looking about the title or something like that. But the people don't have any title to their land, to their housing. It's a strategy here in Jamaica that they don't want to empower our humble people of this earth.
Because housing and land, you see, and it's a strategy. It's a European white supremacist strategy, and that's why we talk about people in black skin but are possessed by Urugu, because it's a strategy used by those in Europe to keep people oppressed and to keep that worker class You understand? We saw that it's the very same strategy they used in the UK against our fathers and mothers who went on the Windrush, and those, even those who went before. That, you know, you raise a color bar and you take them out of the housing situation and make sure that there is no housing, and people riot and riot and riot. No, I think we are rioting too much. I think that we have rioted enough. I think that now is a time that we demand change and we push the boots off our neck and we say this is it. There are too many of us for this to be continuing so long. But one of the things they have done, though, Miguel, is that political tribalism ensures that they can continue to oppress the majority of the people of Jamaica. Do you recognize that?
I agree with you 100%. Because how else could you explain that you have finished pay off for your land, your housing unit 20 odd years ago and don't get no title? And we're talking areas that were run by former prime ministers. How else can you explain it? And I should also point out that, you know, in 1960, when the university did a report on Rastafari, because up to 1960, the persecution was overwhelming against Rastafarians. And some of the brothers invited the university to do a study. Mm-hmm. And they came and did a study. I just mentioned two of the recommendations that study recommended in 1960. One of them was, one, the building of low-rent houses should be accelerated and provision made for self-help cooperative building. Mm-hmm. Next one, government should acquire the principal areas where squatting is now taking place and arrange for water, light, sewage, and disposal and collection of rubbish takes place. Mm-hmm. In other words, our brothers and sisters were in reduced to such destitute condition that these were some of the recommendations that the university team made to the government in 1960.
1960.
And to acquire spaces that at least we had the basic things, water, light, sewage disposal, and so on.
Miguel, is there what's a claim now on Pinnacle, and is there does Rastafari have a claim on Pinnacle? And
well, what is now there, I should point out, is that the government has acquired or something or other with regard to at least one lot. Sometimes I hear they say two lots. So it's either one or two lots that the government is saying we have acquired, and therefore at least there is it has been declared a heritage site with that one lot where there's a part of the great house that is still there. Mm-hmm.
Some time ago, remember, that was the conversation that we were having in 2007 when, I mean, you were part of those conversations and so on. But the point, though, is that you're talking about 500 acres of land. I know people live in Pinnacle now. A lot of people live there. I've had people calling in and saying that, you know, we don't want to move from our land. This is our land, and we've been here for a long time and so on, and we don't know nothing about so and so. But then there's a history to Pinnacle that is well documented. Thank God for the newspapers and the fact that they came at Leonard Howell so hard. There's also, Helen Lee quote you also on this, I think, that there's evidence that Leonard Howell bought that land, that he paid for and bought that land. We know he was tricked out of the land, but we want to go to the point where he bought the land to see if we can return Pinnacle to the people of Jamaica. I don't think that we should just give up so easily on Pinnacle.
No,
I think
I agree with you, yes.
Well, we're going to have to stand for something or fall for anything.
Mm-hmm. What we'll definitely have to do now is to mount a serious challenge to say, well, then look, this land, we can't rely on the courts. We can't rely on the courts at all.
No.
The judges are influenced by their status, their mind, what they read, and as you know, some of these newspapers are the theoretical arm of the government.
Yes, we talked about last week.
Follow what they read, and they think that is gospel and so on.
Oppressive and racist, and this is why I talk again about our tolerance, our patience with oppression, because when you take up a newspaper on any given day, what's said about the masses of the Jamaican people in columns and editorials and so on, anybody should be angry. So how much are we willing to take as far as even that is concerned is another thing. But we talk also about judicial tyranny. That is something that we're still experiencing in Jamaica. So how come we're so comfortable with that? So here we have a human rights issue that somebody like you, Miguel, who has had many years experience, you're an attorney. You're saying the courts are not necessarily the best place to go through with this. So where you go with this? What is the recourse?
No, well, we have to go straight to find a way to commandeer the government, that they have to act. We have to find ways. But
the government has hijacked. The government has
the political trickery and divide of people, and consequently now, when we are to act in a concerted manner, even for the benefit of the people,
exactly,
they come along, give them two nannies or too little money and so on, and the people join them and turn against us.
Exactly. That is exactly the point. And even within Rastafari, and this is why, but we're going to talk, we're going to talk, and we're going to do what we have to do. Deception is a state of mind and the mind of the state. Right? And we see that the Rastafari, to a large extent, has been hijacked by tribal politics. And it's regrettable. Because now we have a system where we hear that there's somebody in charge of Rastafari business in Jamaica, but this is coming out of the Ministry of Culture. This is politics at the highest level. When, since, and how? And how can this, we're going to talk, but today is not necessarily there. I said this morning when I came in that I wasn't going to do enough things, and I'm going to pull back a little bit.
I just want to close by saying that, one of the things that Brother Leonard Howell exalts us to do when he says that do not marry white. Black shouldn't marry white shouldn't marry black. That he calls it race enmity.
Mm-hmm.
It's not racism.
Well,
and we should, let people understand that. But it is race first.
Yes, race first.
Yeah, which Senator Marcus Garvey has taught us.
Exactly.
And which we should continue to emphasize and place emphasis on.
We're talking about the Liverpool riots earlier on, and one of the main reasons for the Liverpool riot was that
sex was an important part.
Yes.
Of the Liverpool riots. Sex was also an important part of Hitler's, I forget the term he used. But Hitler's, when the French soldiers that had gone over there to help liberate Germany, and they started marrying, they had a term for it, that Hitler had carried out against the black, because they didn't want all these children to start coming up.
Mm-hmm. It's not the program. Yeah. It's not the program. Something else. But also, Miguel. Even the what's his name? George Floyd. We have to go further than just thinking that these two people didn't know each other. George Floyd with his white girlfriend and a man who he worked with, and his co-worker coming out to say they knew each other and they were always at loggerheads with each other. And I'm looking beyond to say, well, yes, because he has a white girlfriend, and this is not something that somebody
that
like
white man like,
right? The chauvinist.
Yes.
So
definitely. No, there's a lot of other things involved in that George Floyd situation, and clearly George Floyd didn't think he was going to kill him.
No.
There is no way a 240 pound, 6'6" black man should be lying down and no white boy on top of you. Whether you're handcuffed or not, you should fight.
Well, didn't think you would die. But this is how it is. Well, Miguel, thank you so much. I'm going to talk with Michael Barnett right immediately after you, and then after that I'm going to speak with Catherine Howell, because we're celebrating Leonard Howell this morning, but we're looking at Leonard Howell within the context of systemic racism, colorism, classism, and the destruction of the first self-sufficient black community here in Jamaica, which was a Rastafari community, 500 acres at Pinnacle in St. Catherine. You've really helped us to understand it a whole lot more, Miguel. You do that every time you come on. Thanks so much for the refresher.
And I just repeat the words of one of the songs that Sister Gertrude taught me. Sister Gertrude and Edgar.
Yes.
They said there's a song they said was Leonard Howell's favorite song, and We are not divided, all one family, one in hope and justice, one in charity. We are going to a land where the milk and honey flow. We are not divided, all one family.
Wow.
Give thanks.
Give thanks, Miguel. I appreciate that.
Every time.
All right. Our brother Miguel Lone there. We must learn. If history is important, History is important. It tells us where we are. It tells us what time of day it is. It tells us what should be done, what has been done, and what is to be done, and what should be done. That is why we cannot forget. There are many reasons why some of these things are not taught in schools, The history of Jamaica is not sufficiently and properly taught in schools. We're going to talk to Michael Barnett right after this. Here inside of the Africa Forum, it is Running African. Leonard Percival Howell, Leonard P. Howell, one of the first. This is. There's no argument regarding this. I think this is well documented. To publicly identify and name His Imperial Majesty the Emperor Haile Selassie as a living God. Now, and so as a result, he's called the first Rasta, also called the Gang. But he developed in Jamaica a self-sufficient community at Pinnacle. He purchased land at Pinnacle, 500 acres. That land was destroyed, razed, burned to the ground, and the community destroyed, dispersed. So the Pinnacle diaspora in Jamaica is still without justice. The land taken over. He was tricked out of the land, 500 acres, taken over by developers. So much happening there. So many persons involved in that also. But it's a conversation that we must have because it's an injustice that has not been righted in Jamaica. It's an injustice that still needs attention here in Jamaica. We're talking about repertory justice. Well, this is it. If not this, then what? This is it. So we're not going to get away with just Coral Gardens when you talk about these issues. And even that is yet to be dealt with properly. But we must talk about Pinnacle and Bakawal. We must talk about Pinnacle and Bakawal, but for now it's Pinnacle we're talking about this morning. In the words of Professor Ivan Van Sertima, whether something happened 10,000 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 10 seconds ago, it occupies the same space in our consciousness once we become aware of it. All over the world,